This is the geopolitical iron triangle that guarantees Iran will not fall the way the West hopes. I need you to stop thinking about Iran as an isolated problem that can be solved through sanctions and pressure. I need you to stop believing that if the Islamic Republic collapses, a pro-Western democracy will simply emerge and align with American interests. I need you to understand that Russia and China will never allow that to happen. Not because they love the Ayatollahs, not because they share Iran's ideology, but because a pro-Western Iran would be a strategic catastrophe for both Moscow and Beijing. It would break their influence in the Middle East. It would threaten their energy security. It would give NATO and the United States a dagger pointed at their southern flanks. And they will do whatever it takes to prevent it. This is not about saving the Islamic Republic. This is about preventing American hegemony. This is about preserving a multipolar world order where Russia and China have spheres of influence that cannot be penetrated by the West. And Iran is the keystone. If Iran falls to the West, the entire architecture of Russian and Chinese strategy in the Middle East and Central Asia collapses. So they will prop up the regime. They will provide economic support. They will provide military technology. They will provide diplomatic cover. And if necessary, they will intervene directly to prevent regime change. This is the brutal reality that Washington refuses to accept. Iran will not fall alone. And that changes everything. Let me start with Russia. Because Russia's relationship with Iran is the most critical and the most misunderstood. Russia and Iran are not natural allies. They are historic rivals. The Russian Empire and Persia fought multiple wars over the Caucasus and Central Asia. The Soviet Union occupied northern Iran during World War II. Russia and Iran backed opposite sides in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. They compete for influence in the Caspian Sea. They have different sectarian identities. Russia is Orthodox Christian with a large Muslim minority. Iran is Shia theocratic. On paper, these countries should not be aligned. But geopolitics is not about friendship. It is about interests. And Russia's interests absolutely require that Iran does not become pro-Western. The primary Russian interest is energy. Russia is a petrostate. Over 50% of federal revenue comes from oil and gas exports, and the vast majority of those exports go to Europe. For decades, Europe has been dependent on Russian energy. Russian gas flows through pipelines like Nord Stream, through Ukraine, through Belarus. And that dependence gives Russia enormous leverage. When Europe threatened sanctions over Ukraine, Russia threatened to cut off gas in the winter. When Europeans need heating, that threat, that leverage, is worth more than any military weapon. It allows Russia to divide Europe, to peel off countries like Hungary, Slovakia, Germany that do not want their energy cut off, to prevent a unified European response to Russian aggression. Energy dependence is Russia's geopolitical trump card. But that trump card only works if Europe has no alternative. If Europe can get energy from somewhere else, Russia loses leverage. And the most obvious alternative is Iran. Iran has the second largest natural gas reserves in the world, over 1,200 trillion cubic feet, comparable to Russia. And Iran is geographically positioned to supply Europe through pipelines across Turkey. The Southern Gas Corridor already brings Azerbaijani gas to Europe through Turkey. It could easily be extended to Iran. If Iran flipped pro-Western, if sanctions were lifted, if Western energy companies invested in Iranian gas fields, Europe could replace Russian gas with Iranian gas within 5 to 10 years. New pipelines, new infrastructure, new supply routes. And Russia would be cut out. The revenue would collapse. The leverage would disappear. Europe would no longer fear Russian threats to cut off energy. They would have alternatives. And without that leverage, Russia becomes just another declining power with a GDP smaller than Italy and a military that is being bled dry in Ukraine. This is why Russia will never allow Iran to become pro-Western. It is existential. If Iran aligns with the West, Russia loses its energy dominance in Europe. And without that dominance, Russia has no geopolitical power. So Russia has spent the last decade deepening ties with Iran, selling advanced weapons, S-300 air defense systems, Su-35 fighter jets, military advisors, intelligence sharing. Russia and Iran coordinate in Syria to prop up Assad. Russia provides diplomatic cover for Iran at the UN Security Council, vetoing resolutions, blocking sanctions. And most critically, Russia is now buying Iranian drones. The Shahed 136 kamikaze drones that Russia is using in Ukraine, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, these drones are terrorizing Ukrainian cities, hitting power plants, hitting civilian infrastructure. And they are cheap, far cheaper than Russian cruise missiles. Iran is supplying Russia with a critical military tool, and in exchange, Russia is providing Iran with protection, with technology, with a partnership that ensures Iran is not alone. But Russia's support has limits. Russia does not want Iran to be too strong. Russia does not want Iran to dominate the Middle East. Russia wants Iran to be strong enough to resist Western pressure, but not strong enough to challenge Russian interests. This is a delicate balance. And Russia manages it by controlling the flow of technology, by selling weapons, but not the most advanced systems, by coordinating but not fully integrating. Russia is using Iran, and Iran knows it, but Iran has no choice, because the alternative is isolation, is facing the West alone, and Iran cannot do that. Now let's talk about China, because China's interests in Iran are even more strategic and even more long-term. China is the world's largest importer of oil. China imports over 10 million barrels per day, and the majority of that oil comes from the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, UAE, and Iran. China's economy, its industrial base, its military, everything depends on a stable supply of energy. And that energy flows through vulnerable choke points. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global oil passes. The Strait of Malacca, through which 80% of China's oil imports pass. These are narrow waterways. They can be blockaded, they can be controlled by the US Navy, and in the event of a conflict, in the event of a Taiwan scenario, the United States could choke off China's energy supply by controlling these straits. This is China's nightmare scenario. This is the Malacca dilemma, and Iran is the solution. Iran offers China an alternative. Overland routes, pipelines, the Belt and Road Initiative, China's grand strategy to connect Asia to Europe through infrastructure, runs directly through Iran. China has invested billions in Iranian ports, in roads, and rail lines. The China-Iran Strategic Partnership, signed in 2021, is a 25-year, $400 billion deal that gives China access to Iranian oil at discounted prices in exchange for Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure. But it is not just about oil. It is about diversifying supply routes. If China can import oil and gas from Iran through pipelines across Central Asia, through Pakistan, it reduces dependence on the vulnerable sea routes. It reduces the risk of an American blockade. It ensures that even in a conflict, China has energy. And Iran's geography is critical. Iran is the land bridge between Asia and Europe. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea to Central Asia. If China controls logistics through Iran, it can bypass the maritime choke points entirely. Goods can flow from Chinese factories through Central Asia, through Iran, through Turkey, into Europe. This is the entire logic of the Belt and Road, to create alternative trade routes that do not depend on American-controlled sea lanes. And Iran is the keystone of that strategy. Without Iran, the Belt and Road does not connect. Without Iran, China remains vulnerable to naval blockades. So China will never allow Iran to fall into Western hands, because a pro-Western Iran means American control over the land bridge, means American ability to disrupt Chinese trade routes, means the entire Belt and Road strategy is compromised. But China is also pragmatic. China does not want to be dragged into a war over Iran. China does not want direct confrontation with the United States. So China's support for Iran is calibrated. Economic, not military. China buys Iranian oil, often in violation of US sanctions. China provides technology, telecommunications equipment, surveillance systems that help the regime monitor and control the population. China invests in Iranian infrastructure, but China does not provide advanced weapons. China does not send troops. China maintains plausible deniability, because China's goal is not to save the Islamic Republic out of loyalty. China's goal is to prevent Iran from becoming a Western client state. And as long as Iran remains independent, remains resistant to the West, China's interests are served. And there is another dimension, the multipolar world order. Both Russia and China have staked their entire foreign policy on challenging American unipolarity, on creating a world where the United States is not the sole superpower, where multiple power centers exist, where regional powers have autonomy, where the West cannot impose its will unilaterally. And Iran is a test case. Iran has resisted American pressure for 45 years. Iran has survived sanctions, isolation, military threats. Iran has built a network of proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Shia militias in Iraq, that challenge American allies. Iran is the model of resistance to Western hegemony. And if Iran falls, if the United States succeeds in regime change, it sends a message to every other country that challenges the West. It says that resistance is futile, that eventually America wins, that you cannot survive outside the Western-dominated system. Russia and China cannot allow that message to be sent, because they are next. If Iran falls, the focus shifts to them. The pressure intensifies. The sanctions tighten. The containment strategies expand. So they have to defend Iran, not because they care about the Ayatollahs, but because Iran's survival is proof that the multipolar world is real, that countries can resist the West, that there are alternatives, and that proof is essential for maintaining their own legitimacy, their own resistance to Western pressure. Now, let's talk about what this means in practice. What does Russian and Chinese support for Iran actually look like? First, economic lifelines. China is Iran's largest trading partner. China buys Iranian oil even when it is sanctioned. China pays in yuan, not dollars, bypassing the US financial system. China provides goods, technology, consumer products that Iran cannot get from the West. This keeps the Iranian economy from completely collapsing. It is not enough to make Iran prosperous, but it is enough to keep the regime afloat. Russia provides similar support, though on a smaller scale. Russia sells weapons. Russia coordinates on energy policy to keep oil prices stable. Russia provides diplomatic cover at the UN. Second, military cooperation. Iran supplies Russia with drones. Russia provides Iran with air defense systems, with satellite intelligence, with military advisors. There are reports of Russian technicians helping Iran with its missile program, with its nuclear program. Not openly, not officially, but quietly, in the shadows. Because Russia knows that a nuclear-armed Iran, or an Iran on the threshold of nuclear weapons, is an Iran that cannot be regime changed by the West, because the cost is too high. The risk is too great. So Russia has an interest in Iran advancing its nuclear program, not to the point of an actual weapon, which would trigger Israeli or American strikes, but to the threshold, to the point where Iran is months away from a bomb, where the threat is credible, where the deterrent works. Third, intelligence and technology. China provides Iran with surveillance technology, facial recognition systems, internet monitoring tools. The same systems China uses to control its own population, to suppress the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, are being exported to Iran, and Iran uses them to track protesters, to identify dissidents, to crush opposition. Russia provides similar support, signal intelligence, cyber capabilities. This is how the regime survives, not through popularity, through surveillance and repression. And Russia and China are enablers. But here is the critical question. Would Russia and China intervene militarily to save the Iranian regime if it was collapsing? Would they send troops? Would they risk direct confrontation with the United States and Israel? The answer is almost certainly no. Not for the Islamic Republic itself, but they would intervene to prevent a pro-Western government from taking power. If the regime collapses and there is a power vacuum, if there is a civil war, Russia and China would support factions that are anti-Western, nationalist factions, military factions, anyone who would keep Iran out of Western hands. They would provide weapons, funding, advisors. They would turn Iran into Syria 2.0, a proxy war, multiple factions, external powers supporting different sides, chaos that prevents any one group from consolidating power and aligning with the West. This is the nightmare scenario for regime change. Because even if the Islamic Republic falls, even if the protests succeed, even if the regime collapses, what comes next is not democracy. What comes next is chaos. And in that chaos, Russia and China ensure that Iran does not become pro-Western. They ensure that the country is too unstable, too fractured, too violent for the West to invest in, to integrate, to control. And eventually, some strongman emerges. Maybe a Revolutionary Guards general, maybe a nationalist politician, someone who promises order. And Russia and China back that person, as long as he is anti-Western, as long as he keeps Iran independent, as long as he prevents American bases, prevents Israeli normalization, prevents pipelines to Europe. That is the goal, not to save the Ayatollahs, but to prevent American victory. So, what does this mean for the West? It means that regime change in Iran is a fantasy unless the West is prepared for a prolonged, expensive, bloody intervention. And the West is not prepared. The United States just left Afghanistan. The Iraq War was a disaster. There is no political will in Washington or European capitals for another Middle Eastern war. The public will not support it. The military is overstretched. The cost is too high. So the sanctions continue. The pressure continues. The hope is that somehow, magically, the Iranian people will overthrow the regime and install a pro-Western government. But Russia and China are ensuring that will not happen. They are providing the regime with the tools to survive. And if the regime falls, they are preparing to ensure the successor is not pro-Western. This is the brutal geopolitical reality. Iran will not fall the way the West wants, because Russia and China will not allow it. Their interests are too great. The stakes are too high. They will do whatever it takes to keep Iran out of Western hands. And until the West accepts this reality, until the West stops fantasizing about easy regime change and starts developing strategies that account for Russian and Chinese opposition, the stalemate will continue. The sanctions will continue. The suffering of the Iranian people will continue. And the Islamic Republic, or something like it, will continue. Because Moscow and Beijing have decided that Iran cannot fall. And in geopolitics, what Moscow and Beijing decide matters. A lot. This is why Russia and China will not let Iran fall, and why the West's strategy is doomed to fail.